This is Joe Kopsick. It's August 24th, 2018. A little over 2 months ago, I did a presentation about left-wing market anarchism and the connection between the libertarian right and the libertarian left. I presented this on the north side of Chicago at a restaurant to a group of intellectuals called the College of Complexes. They're billed as the playground for people who think, and the College of Complexes literally refers to people with complexes, smart people who are crazy and have issues and need to yell about politics. So the guy in charge of it is named Charles Paidock, and another guy who posted the video is kind of second in command is named Tim Bolger. So I'd like to thank him for filming this and sharing this video. And I'm making this video because I wanted to rebut some of the things that Charles Paidock said after my presentation, criticizing me basically as just any other libertarian, like one who's not making any attempts to, help the poor afford things or help the market achieve more cooperative property ownership or more egalitarian or fair markets. I made a lot of points such as those, and he just kind of didn't seem to notice them. So I'm just going to respond to his criticism of my presentation.
Thank you, Tim, for helping out. All right, and particular thing, our speaker, that was good first shot. You're doing all your time's up, sir. Next time you come here, I have an idea what he was trying to do was to blend two antithetical political theories and philosophies and show that they were compatible. Whether you succeeded or not remains covered a lot there in a short period of time. I'll be eclectic as usual here. First of all, I heard that socialism is illogical. I spent last week in a rural area. Very common in rural areas to have co-ops. Why do they have co-ops? Because socialistic cooperative activities increase one's chances of success and survival. Farmers realize that, whether it be barn raising or putting up a cabin, collective efforts are possibly the only way success can in fact be achieved. One of the first things, many people don't realize this, the first pieces of automated mechanized equipment in agriculture were purchases made by people who lived next to each other. And that way they shared the equipment and benefited by the automation.
What he's describing sounds like a perfectly pro-technology, pro-property ownership, pro-voluntary sharing, voluntary cooperations kind of thing. And that's I'm totally fine with that. I wish he would have been more careful to explain that it wasn't me who said that socialism is illogical. I think one of the other people who commented about my presentation, they said it was illogical. I don't remember who, but he is rebutting the idea that socialism is illogical, which I had never claimed.
But apparently, you are unable, and Ayn Rand was unable to find anything, amazingly enough, in the history of the United States to show that socialistic activities were in fact a very logical thing to do. Anybody knows that in any collective enterprise, if you work cooperatively, it augments mathematically your chances of success. That's big.
That is correct. Pooling your purchasing power together helps save on bargaining. Bargaining for lower prices. It helps save on bargaining costs to pool your power and purchasing power together. Pool your money together. I'm not against that. I'm not an Ayn Rand worshiper. I've criticized her stance on, basically industrial development, making one set of people superior to another. Basically, she was arguing against she made some statements excusing, massacres against Palestinians and Native Americans based on the idea that the Palestinians hadn't developed or contributed technologically and the Native Americans had no concept of property rights. I see a lot of the things she said as basically dehumanizing. I agree with some of the things she says that, maybe altruism doesn't exist. Maybe we only help people when we at least think it's not going to hurt us or when we think it's going to benefit us. Maybe. I'm not an Ayn Rand. I'm not an Atlas Shrugged beater is what I'm trying to say.
Basic logic.
That's called the corporation.
And
Now, Tim interjects here. He said, that's called a corporation, after Charlie says that working together and pooling your property, cooperativism, is a way to help people and help the poor and make sure the individuals are well protected and that their interests are acknowledged. I don't have any disagreement with what Charlie said. I don't know about what Tim said. I wouldn't say that that's always how a corporation behaves. If you focus on like the private property, like sharing legitimately, legally entitled pieces of private property, if you're talking about that, focusing on that, then a corporation would qualify. But you have to also know what a cooperative corporation is, and that's something like, look at the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. They have many branches around the world, and they have varying degrees of hierarchy and horizontality depending on which branch you're talking about. So yeah, there are similar things that cooperatives and corporations share. They function as what free marketers like to call islands of central planning, just as government does.
Next thing is the Wagner Act. There's an absolutely, listen, I'm a little wobbly, but when the Wagner Act came, it changed the whole complexion of things. We have only 6, you know what I mean? We got about 6 labor laws in the history of this whole country, and they can't even tolerate one. Those 6, it bothers them.
So what Charlie is criticizing is the fact that I don't support certain portions of the Wagner Act, which was the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, one of the first major pieces of federal labor legislation under FDR, which managed to survive. And it resulted in the creation of the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, which is a federal bureau made up of people appointed by the president. I think it's 2 separate councils of different sizes, and they negotiate with unions on behalf of the government, on behalf of people. They moderate labor disputes, and I don't think that what they always do is helpful, especially not helpful to the labor movement while there's a Republican in charge of the government, because they can appoint whoever they want, and that can cause lack of acknowledgement of workers' rights in the workplace.
I get lecture on this. I go, there's only 6 laws, It's really not tough, the no labor law. And they hate that one. Why? Because people hold an election and said, we should bargain collectively and have a contract.
We don't have a problem with the voluntary elections or voluntary contracts. The problem that we have with the Wagner Act as libertarians is that it is a federal law which compels private unions to have elections and to have majority elections, and requires and compels the union receiving the majority vote to represent everyone, even when they don't pay for that representation. You see, the Wagner Act creates the free rider problem. It makes free riders of people who might not even want to be free riders. Some of these people might even want to form their own unions, but it would be difficult since one union has the majority power. So forcing an election on a union might cause the biggest, most powerful union in it to be dissolved in case it doesn't have enough support. If it's got 49%, it could be the biggest union in the workplace, but it still won't. This state of affairs is set up by 80-year-old federal labor laws. FDR was, he was a banker. He was not a socialist. He was inspired by some socialist influenced reforms like Norman Thomas's ideas. But he was not overall a socialist. And we have to keep that in mind when we consider what he did with banking regulation and unions, Japanese internment, and confiscating people's gold and turning around and selling it for 28% of the additional value.
And the thing with the Wagner Act, it ends in the legal right to be fired with just cause, only for just cause, not arbitrary and capriciously, at will.
I have to go back one sec. I'm not sure if I caught him right.
And they hate that one. Why? Because people hold an election and said, we should bargain collectively and have a contract. And the thing with the Wagner Act, it ends in the legal right to be fired with just cause, only for just cause, not arbitrary and capriciously, at will. That's
I don't think that the purpose of the government is to protect people from being fired. I think there are plenty of times when labor contracts can last, decades, and they can have the effect of suppressing and stagnating wages and the potential for raises. Some of these labor contracts are decades old, and they're made with projections. They were written in the mindset that, of economic projections based on 30-year-old economic statistics. That stagnates wages. That's why wages aren't rising. The salaries of CEOs are rising.
All the other things apart it means the boss just can't look at you and say, get out of here, I'm giving your job to my goofy son who's incompetent.
Yet, I know that the vast minority of businesses in this country are cooperatives, but if there ever arises a time in which cooperatives are more dominant, which I hope for, and if there ever arises a time in which most people who are employed by cooperatives, then we do want to make sure that cooperatives have the right to fire people. There's nothing inherently bad about firing people as long as there are a lot of options, whether it's other work options or ways to make ends meet that don't involve working in a legitimized, regulated, taxed, licensed job, McJob, some call it. As long as people have that option to work for themselves or to homestead, to gift, trade, barter, share, and control their own monetary destiny by engaging in competing currencies, then it's not really going to matter whether people can be fired without cause. It's actually, there's some statistics out there that show that, young people today, millennials, we're not quitting our jobs because we don't want to work. We're quitting our jobs after 2 years because we know there's better jobs waiting around the corner for us as soon as we quit. And that if we quit our jobs often enough, the demand for labor will go up, and with it, the wages will go up.
That's what it's for. The other thing is government, and first time I heard this, I remember where I heard it at a restaurant in Belmont with our former libertarian guy. Government is not violent and aggressive. Governments are very good.
He says governments are not violent and aggressive. Governments are very good. About 200 million people died as a result of, died at the hands of their own government in the 20th century. According to a professor at the University of Hawaii, 55 million of those were in countries that had legally disarmed their own citizens first. I don't know what this guy's talking about. The state is organized violence. It is legitimized organized violence. I barely can tell the difference between the definition of the state and the definition of a terrorist group. The only difference is the state has territory and the terrorist group doesn't, unless you're talking about ISIS. So now really, where's the difference? Government is a terrorist organization. Check out the YouTube video, Top 10 Reasons Why the Mafia is Better Than the State. You can even make the argument that crime syndicates are more responsive to people's needs than the government, is, because different crime syndicates could always take over. So there's at least some competition.
The absence of government where you have aggression and violence. Don't you guys understand that?
He says he seems to be saying that implying that it's only in the absence of government that you have aggression and violence. Government doesn't prevent aggression and violence. It turns aggression and violence into a for-profit, licensed, legalized system that can legitimize horrendous acts and war crimes and humanitarian catastrophes, mass displacements and deprivations of people. It can excuse all these things through the law. And that's not okay. There's a difference between morality that comes from that comes from the law and versus that come from justice. Look up malum prohibitum, something that is bad because it is prohibited, versus malum in se, something that is bad in and of itself, something which is wrong and therefore should rightfully be criminalized. What Charles is missing, and what some right libertarians are admittedly missing too, is that aggression occurs within the context of legalized state action and within the context of non-state approved action. There's aggression with and without the state. I don't ever I wouldn't ever say that we were ever eliminate all aggression, but I don't think that is a bad aim to try for.
Don't you probably side, guys? Sit around and talk about which side is the absence of government. That's where you end up with warlords or evil people in charge.
We already have evil people in charge. I don't know how Democrats can go rail on about Trump and then say, Trump's public enemy number one. Quick, give him all your guns. That'll solve everything. What are you talking about? Like, how can you say evil people might get in charge of the government if we get rid of the government? No, there would be no government for evil people to take charge of. Destroy the ring.
It's with good government. We have the independent voters of Illinois who call it your source for good government.
We believe that good government is possible. Otherwise, why else would we be running candidates if we didn't believe that?
Government saves lives. It protects the innocent.
Yeah, sometimes.
Did you know that?
Chicago PD.
Or you just look at it. Yes, it does. The Chicago police protect people.
Let's take a look at WGN TV from just a few days ago. Chicago police take disciplinary action after photo of cops sleeping on the job goes viral. Cops do save and protect people sometimes, but they also enforce a lot of laws against victimless crimes, and they bother people who are only minding their own business, even if they do something that might be distasteful to us personally or might be technically illegal and a crime against the public, which is not a real person and cannot make any accusations in court or defend its claims in any real way. If you look up the case Warren v. DC, a 1980s Supreme Court case, you'll see that police don't even have the obligation to protect and serve the general public, at least not without a private contract specifically obligating them to do so. I contend the police mostly protect private property, not human beings, and I think they protect property over human beings a lot of the time. Police will perform hours and hours of body cavity searches and x-rays on someone just because they flicked a cigarette out their car window and therefore they need to be suspected of drugs and patted down. Police plant drugs on people. The Philadelphia police bombed a black neighborhood. It's called the MOVE bombings, abbreviated MOVE. They dropped fire on these people, families. The government has killed families like over and over again.
You got a cop back there. You're goddamn right they do. You're goddamn right, cops do. They put their life on the line for all of us here.
Cops put other people's lives on the line. Did you hear about how the cops stood down at that recent school shooting? Forget which one it is. But no, it's as if they're insured against. They don't want to put their lives on the line. They're not held to any higher standard. They almost never, they'll get fired with leave, and they'll get paid while they're not working, and they rarely receive justice for their crimes against innocent suspects, if you can even call them suspects. What are cops protecting? Like our right to die early so that we don't have to bother going on living? Like, is it cops just making our lives short to make them efficient or something?
Don't give me any jive about that. It's a job I wouldn't do. To go in those situations like that. It's dangerous.
It's a job you wouldn't do. Then why do you want to make someone else do it for you? Why don't you do it yourself? If you want something in this world, you need to do it yourself. Stop relying on other people to do your dirty work for you.
It's a dirty job, apprehending.
And he admits it's a dirty job.
Bad guys and nutcases, whatnot. Kind of all shit. The other thing is, let's see.
Yeah, cops are our last line of defense against nutcases. But if you look at the rates of spousal abuse and child abuse among police officers, they're a lot higher than the general population. Who are cops going to protect us from? Themselves?
What do you do? Socialism is illogical. Every man for himself is more logical.
Again, he left out that I never said socialism is illogical. Somebody else who criticized something I was saying, one of them said it. I never said socialism is illogical. As I point out after this, which I'm not going to play, I told him I didn't say it's illogical. I said it's voluntary. It's fine when it's voluntary.
Logical. Anyway, let's see. And Henry George, I'm sorry, Henry George is a little dated. That land thing was okay around the turn of the century. And I'm going to improve the bottom line of my employer. Yeah. That's my life. My purpose, result of that is to make some guy rich. You're hired. You got to be kidding me, man. Hired.
I don't even know what he's talking about. I never said that his purpose in life is to make some other guy rich. And his saying that Henry George is kind of dated and that was only good around the turn of the century. Well, why don't you believe the same thing about the Wagner Act? That was made 35 years after the turn of the century. Henry George directly influenced Norman Thomas, who directly inspired a lot of FDR's New Deal reforms. If you're rejecting Henry George, then you're rejecting the most solid ideas behind the FDR New Deal that you supposedly support so much, Charles. But really, you're just supporting a distorted, just shaken down, altered version. It's just a collapsed version of Georgism. It makes all the compromises that, like, you could have had land value taxation, and then the socialists go, well, now that we've taken strides towards solving the land question, let's try to monopolize all these other resources. And then that's how it gets out of control. If you just would have fully gotten common control over land and charged private owners rent for occupying those lands, then you would have solved the problem and thus diminished all calls for monopolizing other resources like, products and facilities built on top of the land. If you just let people have equal amounts of land, then they can produce whatever they want on it, and they don't have to depend on anyone. You don't have to deal with any of this welfare, redistribution, allocation, distribution in the first place, markets. You don't even need any of that. All right, that's enough of that. You can watch this on Tim Bolger's channel on YouTube. That's Tim, Tim, Bolger, Bolger. Title of the video is C of C 6-23-18 Left-Wing Market Anarchism of the Libertarian Movement. Posted on August 23rd, 2018. And you can check that out. That is my presentation to the College of Complexes on a philosophy that's also known as free market anti-capitalism. Unfortunately, Charles didn't really seem to get that I was not criticizing socialism. I was just kind of criticizing a neoliberal collapsed version of socialist influenced policies, which is the Wagner Act, which allows whoever's running the government to control labor affairs. And if this guy doesn't like Trump and is in any way suspicious about Trump's dedication to the needs of workers, then he should be as equally concerned as the IWW and I are, and the LP too, the Libertarian Party, about whether the Wagner Act is actually helping workers or not. I contend that it is not. I've written article after article about this. Another thing that you can check out on this topic is an interview from 1989 from an Ohio radio show. Check out the YouTube video. Mike Cinto, that's SCINTO. Mike Cinto Live, WHIO-TV, Channel 7, quote, Right to Work Laws, end quote, from September 5th, 1989, on a channel called Mike Cinto. I had to come back and make a second part of this video because Charles Paidock emailed me and I responded to him. He reiterated some of the questions that he asked me during my presentation, which I did not show during the earlier part of this video. So here is, I'm going to show some quotes by Charles and then my response to those quotes. These are just fragments of the email that he sent me, resummarizing that criticism from the presentation. Now, again, today, 2 months after the presentation, he says, unions are organized by a vote of all employees in a defined bargaining unit. And I says to him, that's correct. And as I understand it, it's a consequence of the Wagner Act. I see that as where the problem begins. Charles says, Right to Work maintains that individual employees can come along and just say, I don't want to go along with the election results, referring to the results of voting for a union. My response was, Not exactly, but more or less, yes. Right to work laws ban union security agreements. I don't support right to work laws, and neither does the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, the radical labor union, and neither does the Libertarian Party governor candidate Cass Jackson. The libertarian critique of right to work laws, at least if you ask people like Friedrich Hayek, is that it's a law that interferes with the obligation of the government to protect and enforce the contracts which private unions make with management. That should be none of the people's business unless they're directly affected by it. Even though right to work laws arguably promote states' rights, many libertarians still care more about honoring contracts and care more about individual rights than they do about states' rights. Many libertarians, including myself and Matt Kuehnel in Michigan, believe that states don't have rights, people do. I believe that both the Wagner Act and right to work laws have wage depressing effects, just for different reasons. That's why I oppose both laws. I'll also add here that right to work laws are just, Hayek described them as just a band aid on these 80-year-old federal labor laws that I think should be repealed. So Charles also said, I am not aware of any such provision in the commonly accepted method of voting anywhere else in the world, referring to the idea that a person can just ignore the results of a democratic election which they chose to participate in. And as a response, I named where in the world they allow that. Here's what I said. Japan has what's called members-only collective bargaining. In that arrangement, nobody is obligated to vote in a union election. Multiple unions called monmus, M-O-N-M-Us, members-only non-majority unions, are allowed to exist in the workplace, and people can easily change membership between them. I believe that this model will lead to more unions in each workplace, more diverse types of unions, and higher union membership, since people will be more likely to be satisfied by at least one of the alternatives available to them, while under the current system they can only choose the union which receives a majority of votes, and thus dominates all the others. Maybe even sues them out of existence, challenges them for the monopoly. See, it's competition for a reward of monopoly. It's not real competition unless multiple unions are allowed to keep existing. It's not supposed to be a game. I worry that forcing a workplace to take a majority vote, this is me talking, on whether to approve a union might result in the most popular union in the workplace being disbanded simply because it doesn't receive 50% or more. I'm not bothered by Bernie Sanders' suggestion to lower that threshold, but I think members-only collective bargaining would work even better than that. Charles says, are you maintaining, like the right to work guy, that employees have some sort of right to disregard election results? Union election takes place per the law and should follow the same rules as any other election conducted under the law. Is this what you were advocating? Here's my response. No, I am advocating that employees shouldn't be compelled to vote in union elections in the first place. Shouldn't be compelled, to repeat. But at the same time, the union shouldn't be obligated to represent people who don't wish to be represented and wish to pay for it. But if there are any costs which the union already footed for past negotiations on behalf of employees that they were obligated to negotiate for, then the employees should be obligated to pay those costs, provided that those funds are not used for political lobbying. They should only pay for the actual costs of negotiating. But I do believe that some democratic decisions can be very harmful to the individual. I don't chiefly mean union elections, of course. Plenty of dictators were elected democratically. That doesn't mean that all democracy is bad. It just means that as a libertarian, I believe that there are certain intrinsic, natural, individual freedoms which should never be put up to a democratic vote, because it could be taken away from us. Among them, the right to life and liberty and justly acquired property, and the right to due process. That's the end of the first email. And here's Charles Paidock's response to my response. The only problem I have ever heard about were suggestions to streamline or simplify the election process itself, e.g. the Employee Free Choice Act, which, by the way, I'm fine with. As I said a moment ago, Bernie Sanders suggested lowering the threshold to get a union to represent people. I think that's what the Employee Free Choice Act involves. So I'm okay. I don't really have a problem with that. But then Charles continues, employers do everything possible to delay the election from taking place so that they can dissuade the employees or fire employees who are behind the organizing efforts. Well, that's true. They do try to manipulate people. Like, I'll just continue what he says. Recently, one company had televisions installed everywhere, even in work areas, showing videos all day, like your pals on that show. Yeah, I don't like bosses being able to, or management being able to propagandize employees, but essentially, it's possible that if we put too much attention towards giving public sector unions more power, then they'll vote themselves more representation and more money from public sector workers, or really just unions in general, could kind of conscript people to into being represented by them. But the point is that if we allow that to happen, then we'll just we'll end up putting up with union leaders propagandizing people and forcing people to take elections when it's convenient for the union leaders, as a way to supposedly counterbalance the power of the boss to propagandize the workers. But really, that's just setting up equal rights to propagandize the workers for both bosses and union leaders. I support the right to strike without regard as to whether the union leader cares, or endorses the same about if the government endorses the strike. Workers should be as autonomous as possible. And if Charles Paidock supports the Employee Free Choice Act and supports giving a smaller minority of workers rights so that workers are protected regardless of whether they're in the majority, then and if he likes Bernie Sanders, who's behind the Employee Free Choice Act, then there's no reason he shouldn't get behind what I'm saying and my agreement with the IWW.